Hello everyone. Welcome to the EasyPower Thursday webinar series. My name is Jim Chastain. I'm your host for today's session. Very often when we're doing the workshop, the Arc Flash workshops, we get questions about PPE details that I am ignorant of, and we're fortunate to have an expert with us today. And before I introduce our guest speaker, we'd like to run our poll questions as we are in the habit of doing. So we appreciate your participation. There's no obligation and no liability. But if you would please respond. Have your workers been trained on proper care and use of your specific Arc Flash and shock PPE? So these are not trick questions, but sometimes they can point out some obligations or some vacancies in our awareness. So we give this about another 10 seconds. Again, thank you for attending today. So here's how folks have weighed in on this. So it looks like about half are kind of in the boat. Appreciate that. Second question. How old are the test reports on file for your ARC rated PPE? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. I take that back, there probably is. But Jim will get into the details on that. But it certainly is no obligation, and if nothing else, we're trying to highlight the ways to improve the safety of the plant. So we're give this about another 10 seconds. Thank you for contributing. Here's how people have weighed in on this. And then finally, does your electrical safety program define a maximum service life for Arc Flash rated PPE? Now we're going to make sure we have Jim's web camera on so that he can do a lot of show and tell, which are probably 50% of the benefit of attending today. So again, thank you for participating. Here's how folks have weighed in on this. Our guest speaker today, as I say, has been a contributor to the EasyPower presentations before. And I'd like to turn the podium over to Jim Pollard with Unlimited PPE.
Fantastic. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. And thank you for joining us in this webinar. It is going to be a slightly informal webinar. This is the first time I've delivered this webinar, so you got to bear with me. I do eat, sleep, and breathe Arc Flash PPE, so quite familiar with the subject matter. But for this purpose, though, I do want to cover some of the high-level points regarding an Arc Flash PPE program. And we have a lot of different details we can dig into here. I did provide a resource through EasyPower that you would have access to, and I'm going to hopefully have time to review that during the webinar today. I also have an example of a PPE section from within an electrical safety program. I'm going to try and just leave that toward the end, so if we have some time, we can review it. I'm expecting we're going to have lots of time. Every time you deliver a presentation for the first time, I think from your experience, you might agree with me that your presentation doesn't go nearly as long as you had anticipated it would. I know I did a keynote presentation a few years ago in Perth, Australia, and I had this thing just, very well written, I thought, well practiced, and then I did some tweaks to it on the airplane over, because you had that big huge time just to get there, and I was doing some practice in front of the mirror in the hotel room. I'm timing myself before I deliver, and sure enough, I came in about halfway to what I needed to deliver for the actual duration of the keynote. I started freaking out, as most people would, I think. So for this presentation, I'm hoping we get about 30 minutes in, at least that much, and then we can answer some questions, and hopefully you take away some value and you're able to apply some of these lessons to your own program as you build out your Arc Flash and shock PPE section. I think to set the table here, we have to describe what is first an electrical safety program. So the Arc Flash and Shock or electrical specific PPE tools and equipment section, it falls under your electrical safety program. So it's not a program on its own. We don't have a standalone Arc Flash PPE program. It should be within the overall your occupational health and safety management system for electrical safety for Arc Flash and Shock. And one section would be your Arc Flash PPE. And it's that one section that we're going to focus on today. I thought that if I was able to cover 3 points with you, then I would have a pretty good success rate here. But it's the what, the why, and the how. So again, the what, the why, the how, that's what I'm going to try and focus on. So what is this? Of course, it's your electrical safety program, and specifically, it's the section pertaining to Arc Flash and Shock PPE. If I look at what is, in my opinion, a compliant and comprehensive program for electrical safety, it includes an engineering, program administration, and training, as well as the PPE tools and equipment. So your overall program really has, I feel, 4 different components to it, 4 major components. And the engineering side of it, the program administration, training, and then last but not least is your PPE tools and equipment. In the hierarchical approach of how we mitigate risk for workers in the workplace with respect to their exposure to electrical hazards, the Arc Flash and Shock PPE is the last of those items. It's the very bottom of the list, but most often it's the most personal. It's what we have access to is readily available, so it's most often discussed, but it is the least effective control to mitigate the hazards of electricity in your workplace. So please don't just jump right to protecting workers with PPE. You do need to follow the hierarchical approach of risk controls. So we talked about the what. Here's my statement on the why. So the reason why you would have an electrical safety program and then a section within it for Arc Flash and Shock PPE is to prevent workplace electrical incidents. That is our top priority. Worker safety is our highest priority. That is the reason why we do this. Secondary reasons would be that we have standards that we want to comply with. There's regulations that would reference standards. There's regulations that have general duty clauses that apply to you as the employer and your responsibility to protect your workers. So first and foremost is our duty of care for worker safety, the individuals performing these work tasks. And then secondary to that would be our compliance to regulations and the applicable standards. It's important to highlight the gravity of electrical hazards. So the latest statistics that we have in our industry in North America, so both in the US and in Canada, is that 1 in 13 fatalities per lost time injury. So there's a very significant ratio here compared to other workplace hazards. So again, for every 13 lost time injuries, we have 1 fatality. That's a very scary ratio, and that contributes to the importance to why we spend so much time on documentation, and then how that documentation will translate into the actual Arc Flash PPE that you're going to procure, you're going to specify, you're going to procure it, and then you're going to deploy it. Training workers on how to use it. I mean, those are all components that we're going to cover in today's webinar. So compliance. There's various different standards that you need to be aware of in terms of compliance. So I believe most of our audience is coming in from the US. So the NFPA 70E standard is the standard for electrical safety in the workplace. The current revision of this is 2021. This came out last year in 2020. I think we're all rather distracted last year and continuing into this year, but just be aware there is a new or recent published edition of the NFPA 70E, and there are many different changes in the standard that you should be accounting for in your electrical safety program, and specifically for Arc Flash and Shock PPE. If you're joining us from Canada, then There's even more changes that apply to Arc Flash PPE in the 2021 edition of the CSA standard. That's the CSA Z462. And just one of those changes that's much different and doesn't exist in the US is an Arc Flash PPE Category 5. So if you're sitting on a program that hasn't been updated in a few years, you have either a little bit of work to do or you have a lot of work to do. So it's something to be aware of. There's other changes that apply to Arc Flash PPE for the Canadian standard. There's actually a variation of methods now for the Arc Flash PPE categories. There's two different ways that you could select Arc Flash PPE using categories versus in the US, there's just the one way, the traditional way. So those are, I guess, topics for another webinar or another conversation. I'm going to provide my contact information at the end of the presentation. I encourage you to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to answer questions or provide webinars on different topics that you might be interested in. But in terms of compliance, there's standards like NFPA 70E, CSA Z462. There is a very long list of ASTM standards, that apply to both Arc Flash and Shock PPE. There's ANSI standards, there's additional CSA standards, so product-specific standards. There's a list as long as my arm, really, in terms of what you need to be aware of. We're hoping that your program, what I would consider anyways a compliant and comprehensive program, would account for all those applicable standards. So skipping on here, so the Arc Flash PPE program itself, again, is a section or a subsection within your overall program. I've included this is from Terry Becker, so TW Becker, Electrical Safety Consulting. Terry and I have been working together for over 10 years. So my company has Unlimited PPE. We represent vendors that provide different products and solutions for Arc Flash hazards in the workplace. The Oberon company is the PPE that I work with. And then there's some consultants that we also do work with. And one of these consultants is Terry, and Terry's program is, to me, in my opinion, second to none. This is the section that he's created on Arc Flash and Shock PPE tools and equipment. So I thought this is really a very good example that we could use here in our webinar together. So it goes over a general policy statement. There's the definition of the specification of PPE that he's included. He has a section on procurement, and that's, to me, it's really important for standardization. If you have a large organization with different sites, maybe you're spread about geographically, you want to ensure that your workers have the same PPE. So if you go from site to site, or if workers transfer from site to site, they have that familiarity, they understand how to use the PPE. So there's specific lessons that would be embedded within your training on care and use that's related to PPE. One of the poll questions that Jim put up for us earlier was, have you trained your workers on your specific PPE? And that, I mean, it is a little bit of a trick question. You have to read it, of course. And it's your specific PPE that I wanted you to focus on, because a lot of training is just generic, off the shelf. You grab the training and then you deliver it, right? And it might be yourselves internally that provide the training for your workers, or you hire a contractor to come in and offer the training. But a lot of training is just standing in front of the room and kind of reading, Arc rated clothing shall meet the requirements of this clause and that clause and that clause. That doesn't really resonate with workers. Not in my experience, does it anyways? Versus if you provide training, or when you provide training, I should say, because it's required to train your workers, you should be using the actual PPE that they would be using. So that way there's familiarity, and then it does resonate with them as they take their training and then go to apply it. So that's something that we're going to talk a bit further about in this webinar. In Terry's table of contents here for the PPE section, he gets into inventory management, performance management. So I'm not going to read all this to you. We can all read, I think, but I am going to cover some points in more detail. The actual Arc Flash and Shock PPE section of your program I can boil it down into three different areas. And those three different areas would be the selection and specifications, performance management, and then inventory management. And those three areas, I know I'm grouping a lot into three, but that would adequately cover all of the requirements from the applicable standards. Now, of course, we don't have that much time today in our webinar to go through all of those requirements, but I'm going to try and cover them at a high level and make myself available to answer questions after. The selection. I love this slide. I mean, personally, I just think of a lot of employers out there, unfortunately, have just looked in their crystal ball for guidance on selecting PPE. It's a joke, but it's not a joke. It's very serious. You should never be trying to use a crystal ball to predict what PPE is necessary. There is a scientific way that you would go about selecting your arc flash and shock PPE, and it's based on the hazards that your workers are exposed to. So protection versus hazards. At the very root of all of your PPE that's used for electrical hazards, you would have your shock hazard, and then you would select your PPE according to that hazard. And for shock, it's actually quite easy. It's more simple, simplified, I should say. So we have rubber insulating gloves that are rated. And these gloves that I'm holding here, this is a class 0 glove. It provides protection for up to 1,000 volts AC. We then have a cover glove. This is a leather protector, and it's designed and intended to provide mechanical protection for the rubber insulating glove. It's worn over top. So you have two gloves that are worn for shock protection. You could actually wear these gloves as well for arc flash protection, and that's noted within the NFPA 70E or CSA Z462 standard. When you are looking at your workers' gloves to see if they have them, if they're rated correctly, if you find those gloves stored together, like I have on my shelf behind me, if you find them stored together like this is a red flag. And it's a red flag because they should be stored separately. What this tells me is that the worker just goes and puts the glove on to go and perform the work, when really they should be performing a pre-use inspection of this glove. And when they're already inserted into each other, you can't adequately pre-use inspect the glove. So protection versus hazard for shock protection is quite simple. Shouldn't say easy. Not much about electrical safety is easy. It can be very confusing. My business that I started 13 years ago, Unlimited PPE, it's been built off of helping employers, my clients, understand the requirements of the applicable standards and put it into a practical way of a solution for your workplace. So for Arc Flash PPE, it's different. You have to identify the hazard. So let's just say this is my detailed label on the equipment if I have done an engineering study, or if I'm using a Arc Flash PPE category method. Those are two different acceptable methods within the standard that we would use to quantify the hazard, and then we can select the appropriate protection. Your PPE program, the section of your electrical safety program that is for Arc Flash and shock PPE, it needs to define this as part of the policy. It is critically important because this is the foundation that we stand on for how we protect our workers. We have to ensure that protection at least matches, or the protection will exceed the hazard. So behind me I have a selection of Arc Flash suit coats, bib overalls. I have Arc Flash suit hoods, Arc Flash face shields. So all this fantastic PPE from the Oberon company. If I'm assessing my hazard as an engineering, using my engineering study or the Arc Flash PPE category method, let's use the example that I need I have a 60 calorie incident energy, and I have to go and select my PPE so that way it's adequately protective for 60 calories. So on my wall here, I have PPE that ranges from 25 calories. The ARC rating is 25 calories. So that would adequately protect me up to 25 calories. I have it ranged up to 100 calories. So for a 60 calorie incident energy, or the thermal energy that the Arc Flash is quantified at, I can grab my 75 cal suit and this would adequately protect me. I could also grab my 100 calorie suit and this would adequately protect me. You're trying to manage the, lessen the burden with protecting the worker. So we don't always want to overprotect beyond the level necessary. You know, wearing a 100 calorie suit for an 8 calorie hazard doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's possible. And if that's all you have available, then that would work. So protection versus hazard, the selection criteria ranges. As I mentioned, from just behind me here alone, I have up to 100 calories. In the market today, you can go up to 140 calories. That's the highest protective arc flash chute that exists. In the 2021 edition of NFPA 70E, we did add information. It's an informational note that helps provide additional guidance for you if the incident energy of your work task, if it exceeds what is commercially available in the market for protection. So in my world with Oberon, we go up to 140 calories. So for that statement to be applicable, the incident energy would have to be in excess of 140 calories in order to actually make use of that. No. When you look at the selection of Arc Flash and Shock PPE, it includes other PPE that is not arc rated, or it's not rated for shock protection. And examples would be your safety glasses or your earplugs. The hard hat does have a shock rating in case you ever did want to put your head into equipment. We don't recommend that. It might be an overhead line. It could be another energized source. But the hard hat does have an arc rating. Does have a shock rating, I should say. There is no arc rating on a hard hat. The face shield does have mechanical protection as well as an arc rating. So there's a variety of different equipment on the market. When you get into the gloves, you can use arc-rated gloves if there's no shock hazard. Otherwise, you're looking at using the shock protective gloves. Rubber insulating glove, leather glove protector over top. Qualified workers only. So this is another question I thought of bringing to Jim at EasyPower to use as a poll question. Because a lot of times workers that are not qualified, or as the standard defines them as unqualified, they are included in training on how to use Arc Flash PPE. It doesn't apply to them, actually. So it's really important that we don't train somebody on PPE that they're not allowed to use. They don't have any permission to use that PPE. It's in a way, it would be giving permission to the worker to go and do something that they're not allowed to do, or they're not qualified to do. So when we're talking about Arc Flash and Shock PPE, we want to look at the qualified worker. An unqualified worker may be operating electrical equipment, but they're not going to need Arc Flash PPE, and if they did, well, then they need specific training on as a qualified worker would require. So getting into the specification end of what I define as those three different sections. So we have the selection and specification. When you're defining your PPE, it's important to be really clear. Arc Flash face shields, as an example, they come in different colors even. Behind me here, when I first started selling Arc Flash PPE 20 years ago, this is all we had. This is a green face shield. In fact, it was much darker than this face shield when I first started selling PPE back around, was it the year 2000? Seems like it was forever ago. Whenever a worker used the green face shields, there's yellow in here as well. And yellow was a way for us to help brighten the work environment. But yellow or amber, it's a primary color. And when you start to filter out amber, you alter color perception. So when you're specifying your PPE, be sure to go to the detail of gray versus green, for example. So if you're looking at my screen, you can see through my webcam, this is what you would see if you're looking through the green tinted face shield. And it alters color. In fact, anything that's yellow just disappears. Let me use an example here. So on this coat, Oberon uses high-vis striping on the arms and the legs. And that high-vis striping, it disappears. It actually appears white when you look through the camera. So if you're an electrical worker, I can think of a few examples when you have to actually perceive colors, such as colors of wires. So if what you're looking through alters the color of the wire, you are more likely to make a mistake. And human error is about 90% of the root cause for arc flashes. So your PPE can, in fact, contribute to human error if it's not specified correctly. And then the example, just to continue that, this is what's considered a neutral density filter. It's a gray lens. So when you're specifying PPE, if you think it's important, like I do, for workers to see colors, grab this one. So you specify true color. There's two different manufacturers in North America. There's Oberon and then the other guys. They have their different marketing or trade names for these. Oberon calls this a true color gray face shield. I keep myself organized here, otherwise my office just blows up. But so specifications are really important. When you're documenting your Arc Flash PPE, I really encourage you to solicit from whoever you buy this from to get the test report. If you're using a catalog, shame on me for not having my catalog readily available. If you're using a manufacturer's catalog, it's going to tell you the ARC rating of the PPE. But what I want to know is the actual ARC rating as it was tested. So the question we asked earlier in the poll was, how old are your test reports on file? There was some requirements that we added in the 2018 edition of NFPA 70E that relate to conformity assessment standards. And then we added a lot of information into Annex H around the ANSI/ICEA 125 conformity assessment standard. So if you are holding your supply chain accountable, whether it's the distributor that you buy your products from or the manufacturer that made them, ensure that they have this conformity assessment level. Ensure that they have test documentation, and they, as the manufacturer, are required to provide it to you. If they tell you we don't have it available, don't just stop there. In fact, the ASTM standards that apply to the clothing, so the fabric testing or hood testing, face shields, all of those different ASTM standards, there's a requirement for the manufacturer to make that available to you as the end user. So grab that test report, keep it on file, and in terms of the conformity level, these test reports must be within 5 years. So if I were to have given some proper instruction to Jim from EasyPower, I would have used the questions, are your test reports older than 5 years? And if they are, to me, they do not fall within the requirements of NFPA 70E. So, and that also aligns with the maximum service life as recommended by most manufacturers, which is 5 years. So if you haven't defined the maximum service life of PPE in your program, that is 5 years. And how do you know this? The easiest way to tell is to grab one of your Arc Flash face shields, which is normally attached to a hard hat. And the hard hat will have a date code. I doubt my camera will focus well enough to show you the date code, but on the inside of the brim, there is a circle with numbers inside of it. There's an arrow pointing to one of those numbers. The numbers are the months of the year. The number on the inside of the circle is the year of manufacture. So my example that I'm holding right now is pointing to the 2, which is the second month of the year, that's February, and the number inside that circle is 16. So that's 2016. This product, this hard hat, is now over 5 years old. So if you're going by a 5-year maximum service life, it's time for you to replace this hard hat. Some hard hats are good for up to 10 years. Depends on the manufacturer and the model. So be sure to ask those questions and include that in your PPE program. The face shield also has a date code. I can see the date code on the bottom chin guard from Oberon, and it's also 2016. It's printed on the chin guard, it's printed on the visor, and it's printed on the side shields. This is a way of holding the supply chain or looking at your inventory and making sure that it is adequate and within its service life. So again, 5 years is the recommended replacement or maximum service life of PPE, and ensure that you have test documentation for everything. You're going to have face shields, suits, you're going to have coats or shirts and pants. Here's an example of an Arc Flash or Arc rated coverall. With this coverall, you're going to want to grab the test report for the fabric. So on the label is going to tell you the Arc rating, and it's going to reference the ASTM F1959. So what I would recommend you do is take any of your PPE and you look at the label, and hopefully the label is still there because it should be. It should not have been cut out. And on the label are going to be references to the applicable standards. So this one garment will have 2 different test reports that you can solicit. You can ask of your distributor or manufacturer. The first one will be the ASTM F1506, 1506. And the second one will be how we determine the Arc rating and what is that Arc rating, and that's the ASTM F1959. I think what would be a helpful resource if I had time to prepare it for you, or for the next time I deliver this webinar, is to provide a list of all the applicable standards for you, and then how that pertains to the equipment. So for a coverall, we want this standard and that standard for test reports. For face shield, we want the ASTM F2178. We also want to see the ANSI Z87. We want to see a few different test reports that relate to the face shield and the hard hat. This is an ugly picture, so I won't leave it on here too long. It says lack of resources. So the story on that goes, the individual's name was Chris Perry. I called him my Arc Flash survivor early in my career. Story came, or actually pictures of an incident came through one of my channels in Canada to me. So this was a worker in northern Saskatchewan, was using an Arc Flash suit. I don't have the old suit here to show you which one it was, but the suit had a hood. And so the worker was actually racking at a power circuit breaker. The worst thing happened is an Arc Flash occurred. The worker was unable to actually see the work task, properly, so they had in their hands a flashlight. When you're using this type of a glove, the rubber insulating glove and leather glove protector, it's hard to operate much of anything, especially a flashlight with little buttons on it. So the worker took off their gloves and was holding the flashlight while they're performing this work task. Their hands were exposed. So this was the result of the Arc Flash on their hands. It's terrible. And what they could have done in their specification of their Arc Flash PPE in their program was to ensure they have adequate lighting. Almost every face shield and suit hood is available today with lighting. It's a standard issue from Oberon to have a belt loop. So if I hold my hood up here, there's a loop at the top, and this is where we mount a light. So this is Oberon's 75 cal suit, and this is where we have a light at the top. So if you can't see the work task properly, you have a light in order to actually illuminate that properly, and you don't have to compromise your safety by removing your gloves. This is another one of those pitfalls, is a long coat. If you're standing up and you have full body protection with the shin guards, you should be fine. But if you have a floor level incident, or if you have to squat like most workers do to perform a work task, you very well have likely opened up your coat and exposed yourself to a burn in a part of your body that you might not want to have burnt. No part of your body is good to be burnt, but this one, I think you can see where I'm coming from. So a long coat is something that you would possibly specify against procurement in your Arc Flash program. Human error. This picture is actually of a video from a manufacturer. I think it's a great manufacturer. However, the worker that is demonstrating how to use the manufacturer's product is doing so with a hacked PPE system. You can easily see, if you're familiar with the requirements of PPE in NFPA 70E, this worker does not have hearing protection. Furthermore, this worker does not have an ARC-rated balaclava. Now, you might argue with me that they're in Category 1 and they don't need a balaclava because the Arc Flash boundary is not big enough to encompass the back of their head. But for the most part, the rule of thumb, if you're using a face shield, you need to wear a balaclava. There's a pretty big area here on that worker's neck that would be exposed to a potential thermal exposure created by an arc flash. Also, this worker, you'll notice on Oberon's face shield, as well as every other arc flash face shield that's compliant in North America, there is a lower chin guard here. But in my picture, there is no lower chin guard. It probably wasn't very comfortable, or maybe it broke and fell off a long time ago. Once you remove that lower chin guard, you have now basically voided any of the protection provided by that face shield. There would still be a little bit of protection, but not nearly the ARC rating that is labeled on that product. So these are examples of PPE that would have been procured for the worker, perhaps, and based on the worker's, I guess, way of using the PPE, they have hacked it. And that, to me, is part of the human error issue that we see out in the workplace. So be sure that we are following up with the workers. And how do we police the PPE being used properly in the workplace? Countermeasures. This is how we do that. We have documentation from our program. It might be a checklist. And I have a checklist I'm providing to you, and I'm going to review maybe if we have some time still. But this checklist is what the worker should be using as part of the pre-job briefing and planning requirements of NFPA 70E. And this would include a section on the PPE tools and equipment. Training. So I mentioned earlier how important training is. And when you're training workers on electrical safety, a lot of it is going to be on how to actually perform the work safely. And part of that, of course, is to implement controls to mitigate risk. And the lowest control, or least effective, is PPE. But we want to make sure it's relevant to what they're using in the workplace. I mentioned that earlier. And it might be an arc flash shoot coat. It could be coveralls. If I were to have time to show you all the details of Terry's program, it defines ESP levels. ESP is an acronym for Electrical Safety Program, and his levels are similar to Annex H, the simplified two-level system in 70E. So he'll have a level up to 8 calories, and then he'll have a level up to 65 or 75 calories. Others will go up even further because PPE does exist above 75 calories and it maxes out at 140 calories. When you're training your workers, ensure that you teach them how to wear the PPE. This is called donning, and then taking it off is doffing. So here's an example of some bib overalls. The bibs have suspenders on them. I would recommend that you keep the suspenders done up, the buckles, done up at the front. So when you go to put the PPE on, have your worker put their back up against the wall, or somewhere that they can take their weight off their legs. It's not usual that you're going to have chairs available in the workplace for them to put their PPE on correctly. So take their weight off. They put one leg in at a time. I know teaching adults how to put their pants on can sound silly, but it is a requirement to the standard that we provide care and use training. It's also a requirement of OSHA or the regulations that apply to you at your workplace, that if you give workers any type of PPE, that you train them on how to care for it and use it. And part of the caring is to pre-use inspect this. So before I even put this PPE on, I need to make sure it's going to work. If there's any rips, holes, tears, or signs or smells of contamination, well, then I know that this needs to be corrected. It needs to be addressed. So pre-use inspection is a requirement for all PPE before you use it. The performance management of your program, that section is going to include pre-use inspection and all the criteria that your workers need to be trained on to identify. So here's an example of Well, here's Terry and here's Cindy, who works with me. So they're scouring through their PPE that is necessary for a work task to pre-use inspect it. You can see Terry's here. He's looking at the face shields. So this is a suit hood from Oberon. I want to make sure the shield doesn't have any damage on it, because if this inhibits my ability to see the work task, well, that's going to compromise my safety, because it could increase my likelihood of making a mistake and possibly causing an arc flash. We want to make sure that the light is operable. Turn that guy off. There's on the back, this one has a hood ventilation system. So when you're wearing an arc flash shoot hood, if it's a traditional beekeeper style or if it's a lift front, it doesn't matter. They get hot. You're going to stand in one position. You're going to perform a work task. If you're moving around from place to place, well, then air might come in and out. But otherwise, for the most part, you're going to stand stationary and perform a work task. So having a ventilation system that brings fresh air from the outside to the inside is very important for worker comfort. If a worker were to have suffer from heat stress, that will then diminish their ability to make good decisions. So if you're starting to get dizzy or disoriented, those are not good things to have happen if you're performing energized work tasks. So the ventilation system is really important if you have to use the hood for any longer than about a minute. And again, no matter what the hood style, they all get hot, so make sure you account for the ventilation. So pre-use inspection, here's an example of one of the older types of face shields. This is a green face shield. This is actually a really easy takeaway for you. If you're not too familiar with Arc Flash PPE, if you look at it, if you look at your worker's PPE, and if it's green, if the lens is green, whether it's in a hood, if it's a green lens in a hood, or if it's a green lens just as a face shield on a hard hat, know that there are safer products that now exist. When you could see properly, it improves human performance, and human performance is critically important. Inventory management. PPE that is related to shock protection must be tested and recertified. So for gloves, this has a 6-month timeline that after 6 months, this cannot be used. It has to be sent off to a laboratory for testing and certification. So that should be accounted for in your program. How do you manage PPE in terms of storage needs to be included in your program. So correct storage versus incorrect storage. This is a picture from an audit. I think this is one of Terry's pictures. You can see the PPE is just shoved in a locker, and it's dirty. I mean, like really dirty. So this is a big problem. I mean, the dirt could compromise the ARC rating and then ultimately the protection for the worker. The fact that they're not storing it right is not going to help the life of the PPE itself. So how to store it correctly? I recommend using Oberon bags. So this is an Oberon storage bag that I have pictured in the presentation. What I love most about this is it has a hard plastic bottom. So if you were to put this into a service vehicle that might have some, maybe it's raining outside, or you put this down in a puddle or in a bank of snow, this will keep the water from coming through the bag and then impacting your actual suit. So proper storage is very important to maintaining your PPE as part of the inventory section of your PPE program. Be sure to include the tools and other equipment that you're going to use. I don't have many examples here, but that's your digital multimeter, your protective grounds, hot sticks, all those different types of equipment are important to keep as part of your PPE program. I want to show you an example of, so this is actually a rescue device that's built into your suit. So if you have a rescue stick, which is typically a 6-foot insulated stick with a shepherd's hook on the end, an alternative to that is now an escape strap. So I'll just demonstrate with Oberon's escape strap here. On the inside of the suit, we've sewn in a Kevlar strap. It's a Kevlar rope. and it's sewn in so it goes around the worker's shoulders. In the event you have to pull a worker or drag them to safety, this will be very effective. On the back, the rope actually just kind of hangs out in this little pocket, and then we can leave it out there, excuse me, so it extends out the back of the coat about 10 feet. You can have a secondary person as a standby. You have a picture right here. Your standby person could be holding the rope at the end in the event that you need to be rescued, whether it was because you've made contact with energized source and you've passed that can't let go threshold, or if the worker were to be, let's say they have some type of a medical emergency and you want to help that worker and pull them to safety. If there is an incident, you can pull them to safety. What Oberon's done is we've actually tested the rope to ensure that it is non-conductive, and that's something that you'd include with your test documentation that supports the PPE that you're using at your workplace. So that's an emergency standby example. This is the audit checklist that I had provided through EasyPower as the resource. I wanted to make sure that you had some tools to go back to your workplace with and start to dig in to where you are in terms of compliance. I can review that if we have some time. I think we're running out of time though, so that's something that I encourage you to print and use on your own. Getting to the end here, Jim, so do we have any questions?
Yeah. A couple questions that I have. How would you address the question or concern people have regarding pressure waves above the 40 calorie per square centimeter?
I'd like to see some proof of that personally, because we're still waiting for it. There's this myth in industry that pressure waves are related to incident energy. Excuse me, it's very dry in my office today. Basically, there is no correlation between incident energy and pressure waves. So there's the myth is around arc blast. And whenever I say there's Arc Flash PPE above 40 calories, I always get these questions. So I've been answering these questions for a very long time. The actual blast or this pressure wave is more of a component of the short circuit fault current, which is part of the calculation that we use to calculate incident energy. But there is no direct correlation between the amount of incident energy and what that blast pressure might be. So if you look at your calculation in detail, if you have a long clearing time but a very low fault current, you could still end up with a great deal of incident energy, but very little power behind it. You could have a very short clearing time, very high fault current, and end up with more potential for that pressure. There have been papers presented and published. I know Hugh Hoagland has done one, and there's others that I can think of, excuse me, that have related to the pressure to containment. The moment you open up a door, remove a cover, you have removed or mitigated, I should say, this pressure, this pressure vessel that's created by an enclosed space and an arc flash occurring. Most electrical work is done with the door open or cover off. So therefore, we've mitigated that pressure or that containment issue related to blast pressure. Furthering that along, not one worker, in my knowledge, has ever died from an arc blast. But yet most trainers have stories about arc flash chutes being body bags if they're used above 40 calories. There's no proof. So again, back to my first statement, I'd like to see somebody show me some proof and evidence, and then we can talk further about that. I would be a little more concerned about the lighter weight suits, and we're getting lighter and lighter and lighter for a 40 cal suit. What then is the protection for the mechanical protection required for the worker? So it is conceivable that we're going to have flying debris and projectiles. As we get down to these very thin layers for protection, what are we then providing for our worker in the event of an arc flash? All these suits that I've been showing you, these black suits, they're actually made of aramid fibers. And this is all Kevlar on the inside. So these are very strong. There's far more issues that we should be addressing. There is no real correlation between blast and above 40 calories. Hope that answers your question.
Was pretty good. Here's one that's kind of associated with it. What about labeling using danger versus warning for specific incident energy levels?
Well, danger versus warning, that has to do with danger is like death imminent versus warning is you're going to get injured. If you define a maximum allowable working level in your program, that becomes the point where you go from a warning label to a danger label. A danger label, to me, you're not allowed to perform work on that, ever. If it's a warning label, then if you have enough controls in place, well, then you're allowed to perform work. It comes back to your risk assessment and the available controls that you have to implement and mitigate that risk to an acceptable level. But that's something that you define in your program, and that might be 100 calories, it could be 140 calories, it might be 10 calories. If you don't want to have workers work above 10 calories, well, that's where you start putting danger on the label versus warning.
Okay, here's a follow-up question. Is Arc Flash PPE required to open and close a breaker regardless of the voltage?
It depends on your risk assessment and your risk tolerance. There's examples on either side of that. I mean, that's a deep dark hole that you might have me travel down, but I'm not going to go down it. If it's equipment in a normal operating condition, should we expect it's going to arc flash? In a normal operating condition, really? I mean, like we have a lot of standards, that we rely on. I can't just say that anything's going to just arc flash around me just because it can.
Fair enough. So those of you that haven't, you can also send questions to Jim as emails on the screen, unlimitedppe.com. I think that's a list of questions we have from this side, Jim. Appreciate fine demonstration and presentation, and we hope we can have you back again in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I encourage anybody that has questions, or if my answers weren't sufficient, then we can just give me a call. We can talk about it.
Sounds good. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.